Yeah, it's a great honor to be starting off the discussion of such a distinguished panel. And of course, before I start, I'd just like to mention and to kind of remember the very tragic death of a very young and important part of our journalism milieu yesterday, Mr. Danish Siddiqui, who died while covering battlefield action in Spin Boldak in Afghanistan. It's a tremendous loss, and it's something that, as journalists, we all feel very deeply, even if we were not familiar with him at a personal level. And of course, I should also mention the number of colleagues, professional colleagues, who are now languishing in jail under one section of the law or the other. And I'm kind of heartened by the newly found interest that the Supreme Court is taking in the law of sedition, and I hope very much that we'll have a good outcome from the hearings that are just beginning in the Supreme Court over the constitutionality of the law of sedition. So, having said that, of course, the state of the media today is much more than the state of the jeopardy that it faces from a hostile legal environment. There is much else that should concern us about the state of the media today. And of course, when you start this discussion, you have to kind of start with some kind of an understanding of what is this entity that we're talking about. And of course, since the time of our independence right till now, we've had several debates over the proper place of the media within a democratic republic, and what are the kind of safeguards it requires, and does it require safeguards additional to those that any citizen enjoys, right? Those kind of questions have been repeatedly debated. But by and large, those debates have remained inconclusive. And in that time, we've had dramatic changes in the kind of media ecosystem. The technological foundations have changed very rapidly. And the way that the public, the general citizens, relate to the media has also changed very rapidly. So, what does all that mean? Now, I just would like to frame the question in terms of what the media is, and I understand it as a platform on which a society talks to itself, a nation talks to itself, right? That we are as a nation, we have certain kinds of invisible bonds between all citizens, and it's a community of anonymity in many senses, because I don't know more than a handful of other citizens in this vast kind of country. So the media is a platform on which I talk to them, they talk to me, and we kind of get to know each other, and we kind of identify with each other as people who share this common sense of citizenship. Now, this is, of course, an important scholarly theme that has been part of the work of great scholars like Benedict Anderson, the imagined community, rather, the imagined community, and so on. It's an important theoretical construct, and it's very important to understand the media and the kind of the kind of public discourse that is conducted through the media plays a very important part in consolidating the sense of imagined community, which is the nation. So, like I said, since independence, we've had multiple efforts to kind of properly contextualize what is the media, what role does it play in our democratic system, and what are the kinds of safeguards that we need to ensure that so that it fulfills those functions properly. And of course, there was a change at the time of independence, and the change was kind of put very aptly by the Hindu in an editorial back in the 1950s, at the time that the first press commission submitted its report, and came up with this whole kind of construct of how the media should be regulated and how can it play its proper role in a democratic setup. And the Hindu said that this is a time of transition. It's a time when the media is transforming from a camp follower of a political cause, which is the cause of freedom, into a state of autonomy and into being a part of the industrial structure. So there's a transition underway, and that transition should be recognized, and that the new kinds of regulatory systems being evolved should understand that this transition is important. That's very important to have the media evolving into an autonomous entity. Now, there have been since then multiple other efforts to understand or to kind of evolve a proper kind of regulatory framework uh, through legislation and through various other kinds of measures. The press council was set up, and there was a second press commission in the 1970s, and multiple judgments of the Supreme Court, of course, on one aspect of media functioning and another. And while this was going on, and I'm sure that the trajectory was a salutary one. It was heading towards maybe a good outcome, but then changes kind of overtook that whole process. And what are the changes that happened in the 1990s? You had the decade of triumphant globalization, as I would call it, when barriers of the nation state were broken down and you opened up to global kind of penetration. You had a shift in the kind of philosophy of many of the media houses to kind of a more clear-cut kind of focus on the profit motive. Till then, the media had two kinds of identities. It was on the one side a kind of forum for public dialogue, on the other side it was also a commercially oriented industry. But 1990s, I believe that the second, profit orientation, somehow kind of won out over the other function. And of course, the one media entity that best kind of symbolizes that change is the country's biggest media house, the Times of India Group, which started various kinds of predatory practices in the 1990s, which in a sense had been foreseen by the press commission back in the 1950s. They said that we should have deterrence to this kind of predatory behavior because it's very important to protect diversity in the media ecosystem. But there was very little done along those lines back in the 1950s, and whatever was done was, of course, kind of clumsy. It was struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. So you had a kind of doorway kept open for this kind of predatory commercial practices by the biggest media group in the country, and of course that set underway a certain kind of dynamic within the industry as a whole, because everybody had to compete to stay abreast. And it's at precisely this time that you had the kind of invasion from the sky, as they call it. Because till then we had been fairly kind of content with keeping broadcasting as a government monopoly. There were efforts, of course, to build in some recognition of diversity and plurality into that monopoly, like the Prasar Bharati Act and so on. But none of it really became operational. So in that vacuum, you had the sudden kind of invasion of the skies in the 1990s. The Gulf War in 1991 was a turning point when CNN suddenly kind of became a global kind of, a globally recognized kind of news brand. And by middle of the 1990s, you had virtually unfettered access for multiple global broadcasting channels into the Indian space, right? And there was no way that we could control that. The government was got completely off balance and just had no response to it. And when it did come up with a response, it was something in the nature of what could be called intermediary liability. They put the entire onus of regulating content upon the cable operator, who had very little control really over content, right? But that was the only place where they could exercise legal jurisdiction without invoking some form of extraterritoriality, right? Because the broadcasters were all sitting in faraway places like Singapore and Hong Kong and so on. So while we were struggling with that, then of course you had the great disruptor, which was the internet, that came into the picture. And 1995 is when the internet starts off in India. By 1998, 99, it's becoming kind of, it's spreading, it's proliferating in terms of access. And of course, access was expensive and required a computer and so on, computer ownership and so on. And I think in the first phase of the internet, what could be called the internet 1.0, the media saw it as a fairly benign presence. It saw it as a way that they could expand their reach, because mostly the internet content was text-based. There was very little video and audio content that could be transacted over the internet. It was mostly text-based, so it fitted in well with the kind of competences of our media industry, right? The free media industry. I'm not talking about the broadcasting sector yet. But then you had that situation changing very rapidly, and from Google, the first IPO that Google came out with in 2004, arrival of Gmail, and then of course Facebook and the social media revolution from 2007-8 onwards, you had that entire scenario change. And again, for a while, people thought that this is benign, that you can kind of deal with it. It's opening up, media platforms for participation by a large range of people who are otherwise deprived of a voice. But I think in 2016, it came to a real watershed moment when, for instance, we suddenly realized with the events in the United Kingdom and USA with Donald Trump's election. And of course, we had also encountered our own kind of WhatsApp-based propaganda, political propaganda, 2014, and more so in 2019. So now we know that it's not quite so simple. This algorithmic kind of news, curating of news, and the advertising model that rides on the kind of profiling of users and an algorithmic tailoring of news content to a very, very minute understanding of that user's profile is really creating filter bubbles. It's creating, far from creating a sense of community, it's creating a sense of kind of atomization. We're all kind of, looking for our own best fit in terms of, where do we belong? I mean, and I would like to belong in an echo chamber where everybody's saying the same thing that I believe in, where my kind of beliefs are not challenged. And so that creates this kind of what's called a filter bubble, and creates room for various kinds of political dysfunctions. So that's where we are standing at this moment. And I think before I wrap up, I think, yeah, I'm almost at the end of my time. But before I wrap up, I just would like to refer to the current conjuncture. I'm sure that Pamela has actually encountered this at first hand, the kind of new information technology rules that have been introduced to put some form of curb on the digital media. Now, of course, they have made it very clear that this new structure of regulation, which involves firstly an internal system within each of the media platforms, then a kind of collective body involving all of them put together, all the media platforms of a particular genre, like for instance, digital natives would all be clubbed into one entity, and they would have to have a collective regulatory body. The traditional media that has a digital footprint would also have to have their own collective regulatory body, and so too the TV, broadcast media. And above all this, of course, is the virtually untrammeled power grab of the executive, right? The committee of secretaries has arrogated to itself virtually untrammeled power to decide finally what is permissible on each of these media platforms and what is not. Now, this is a completely new situation that we're confronting, and it is a paradigm change, and I think it's a significant threat to freedom of the media, freedom of expression, more defined more generally as a right of all citizens. So, thank you so much for the patient hearing. I'll stop there.